I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about the implementation of the Childcare and Development Block Grant, which, from our point of view, looks like a very large unfunded federal mandate. And while additional site inspections, background checks, new background checks on some 220,000 providers, new training professional development requirements, and a whole new approach to parental eligibility is welcome. And I think many of the advocates welcome that improvement in the system. Estimates are very troubling as to what that would cost, upwards of $90 million just for the first three items that I mentioned, and an unknown amount for the parent eligibility. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe we could go through step by step some of those areas, and we can sort of compare notes and see what you have in mind. The first one has to do with training and development. That needs to be completed, our understanding is, by September 2016, and budget estimates are about $20 million. Do you have any additional information on that, whether or not we already have something in place that would be eligible for that, or whether we're doing something new?
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Great questions. So if I could just for a minute, because I think there's a lot of questions about the implementation of this act, I think just to kind of set a contextual stage a bit. So the act was passed and signed by President Obama in November of 14. And of course, at that time, we saw the implications, as has every other state, in terms of the magnitude, Assemblywoman, that you just pointed out, without any federal money coming to help states try to address the implementation of this. We've been advocating really since the passage of the bill through our governor's D.C. office, through all the advocacy groups that we belong to at OCFS, really expressing to the federal government just what you said, Assemblywoman, that on its face, who can argue, right, with increasing quality? Who can argue with enhanced training, all those kinds of things? But for the federal government to expect states like New York, who already make such a deep investment in subsidy, to really find a way to fund all of these new requirements is really problematic. On top of that, the federal government waited until December of 2015 to issue their draft regulations. And all of us who are now looking at those draft regulations across the country are further alarmed that those regulations actually seem to go far beyond what the initial statute said. So that public comment period is open right now. It will close on February 22nd. And we are putting together our comments. We're imploring all of our partners, including all of you, to be a strong and loud voice on behalf of our families in New York State, that without additional federal funding, states are really left with either requesting extensions for some of the provisions until we really understand what the final federal regulations will come out and look like, or that we continue to advocate for more money. The worst possible scenario, which is one that many states are facing, to comply with the federal requirements, absent any additional federal funding, you're looking at decreasing your subsidies, right? Moving your state's investment in subsidies, which we all know is key for our families, and using it to try and support some of the unfunded mandates of this act. So the final part of your question, though, Assemblywoman, is as we're looking at the proposed act as well as the regulations, we're also making a careful list of the things we currently do in New York State. And so you all know we're one of the most regulated states in child care in the country as it is now. And so we do a lot of pre-qualification. We do a lot of clearances for interested providers, in-state clearances, SCR clearances. We check providers against the Justice Center staff inclusion list. We don't do the national checks that are called for in the act, but in fact we do a lot in our state, and so we're trying to make that case where we can to prove that we do have that capacity. Again, Assemblywoman, we don't have a sense whether or not the federal government is going to recognize, those efforts.
So we seem to be in a little bit of a time frame collision. And our concern is that if we don't get this right or understand the implications, we're going to drive providers underground, risk losing subsidies, as you mentioned, we're going to lower quality. And I mean, we already have a fragile system, and this is going to threaten and risk it even further. So can you walk us through that one more time? We're hoping the federal government will come to the rescue, but in the meantime, are we at least planning to be, out in front of this to avoid calamity in the long run?
Yeah. Yes, Senator or Assemblywoman, we have been out in front of it. I mean, we continue to, and especially now that the draft regulations are out there, I think states have been put in a really untenable position trying to implement, an act with so many moving parts, all of which cost so much money. Not many of them are one-time expenses or non-reoccurring. When you're in to this, you're in for the long haul. So I want to assure you and all the members here that we are advocating very strongly. I think, frankly, it's going to take a broader voice, including our legislature, to really help say we cannot afford to do this. And the other fact of the matter is that our administration, with support of all of you, have invested a lot of money in daycare. We have almost $800 million in the budget. We have other quality initiatives. And so it's a real challenge for us, Assemblywoman.
So you did put $10 million, or I'm sorry, the governor put $10 million in the budget toward one of the components of this. So again, just so I understand we're all on the same track, our hope is to either get an extension, to appeal to the federal government to help pay for this, but by April 1st, we have to have a budget that at least has some additional resources put toward this, if need be. I can't imagine we're going to be able to pull this off with just $10 million. Would you agree with that?
I think it's going to be very challenging, absent additional federal money, for us to pull off the requirements within the time frames that the Act calls for.
I see. We also noticed that there's nothing in the budget to address the market rate change. Regrettably, certainly in my area and many parts of the state, when you went down to the 69th percentile, it really hurt and doesn't reflect the cost of delivery of service. But there's no recognition of the market rate in the budget, and we'd like to see it get back up to the 75th percentile. What's the overall game plan on market rate?
Yes, so the overall game plan on the market rate, Assemblywoman, is that we do plan, and it will be part of the federal plan that we have to submit on March 1st or 31st to the federal government. We do plan on supporting the new market rate effective June 1st, again at 69%. So unfortunately, I think for many of the reasons we just discussed, we're not able to go to 75% as we enjoyed for a number of years, but again, at the 69th percentile, which I would just add is we're probably one of only 3 states left in the country who are able to maintain that level of support for the market rate.
So how can we help you on this federal advocacy specifically?
I think certainly joining with us to have a conversation with the feds, to have a conversation with our congressional, delegation. I think your voices are really important in this conversation. We've done our best to date. We need local departments of social services. We need the advocates. But in your positions as elected officials representing thousands of constituents, families, providers, I think you have an incredibly powerful voice that we'd like to tap in, very soon to really let folks know that without additional support, we're really in a very tough spot.
I'd just like to get your opinion about one other item having to do with the background checks. What's your opinion about requiring that be portable? So when someone has that background check and works for a provider for 2 months and then moves along, that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, that it could perhaps stay with them for a period of time. It would, in light of this implementation, probably drive down the cost in the long run.
Yes, I think on principle that makes sense for all the reasons, that you just articulated. Again, the upfront costs of making that happen, particularly having to navigate through the requirement that you have to go across the nation and check any place that the potential provider has lived in the past 5 years. and there's no foundational work that's been done to date by the federal government in creating, you know, those pathways of communication so that we could create, you know, the portability of those clearances, because you're right, having to re-clear people time and time again is really not the most efficient way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.